कनेक्शन गई का
हाँ
आपका?
ओके, अभी आवाज आ रही है?
जी जी जी,
अभी आवाज आ रही है?
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल
अभी
ठीक है।
फिर एक बार कर देता हूँ। अभी कुछ लोग जुड़ गए ना हमारे। ओके, गुड आफ्टरनून एवरीवन। आई एम डॉक्टर संतोष राडे, असिस्टेंट प्रोफेसर ऑफ इंग्लिश, Anandibai Ravrane Arts, Commerce and Science College, Vaibhavadi, District Sindhurg of Maharashtra. It is affiliated to University of Mumbai. I welcome everybody to today's third session of this refresher course in languages, organized by HRDC Punjab University, Patiala. I feel very pleased to introduce Honorable Resource Person of this session, Professor Padma Nepal sir. Professor Padma Nepal sir is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science, St. Joseph's College, North Point, Darjeeling. He is a research and development consultant at NGOs and he has published several research articles in a wide range of academic journals of repute. He has delivered UGC special lectures in UGC refresher courses, and ICSSR social research methodology courses. Besides this, he is also authored and edited several books and research monographs. His areas of research interest include alternative social research methodologies, critical epistemologies and pedagogies, green political theory, folklore, life worlds and cultural dimensions of politics, micropolitics, microhistories, myth histories, and politics of nations and ethnicity, methodologies of collective action studies, and spatial, symbolic, and material meditations of social movements. I once again welcome Professor Padma Nepal sir and I invite him to share his views with us. Over to you,
संतोष
sir.
सर का कनेक्शन फिर
हाँ,
टूट गया।
अतिथि महोदय से निवेदन है कि वो प्रारंभ करें
हाँ जी,
सत्र।
हाँ जी।
जी
Namaskar. Am I audible to everyone?
जी
जी
सर जी।
श्रीमान।
Yes, sir.
Namaskar to everyone. First of all, good afternoon. And let me introduce myself briefly before I begin the talk today. I'm Padam Nepal. I'm from Darjeeling, hills of West Bengal. My subject is political science, but I also deal with translation studies, basically Nepali literature into English. In other words, what I have been also doing is I'm a practitioner of Indian Nepali literature in English. So today I would first like to thank the director and the coordinators of the present course, a refresher course on languages conducted by Punjabi University, Patiala. And it's my privilege to talk to friends, a wide range of friends from different disciplines, I believe, languages. And it's my honor to talk about my own literature. In fact, many of us might not know about Nepali literature, and I don't know how fruitful it's going to be, but I'll be briefly talking about evolution and some central themes of the Indian Nepali literature in some kind of a reflective manner, because when we talk about Nepali literature, we usually tend to confuse between the literature produced by the Gorkhas. The Nepali community in India is called the Gorkha community, and we have some differences in both language as well as literature with what is practiced in our neighboring country, that is Nepal. So when we talk about Indian Nepali literature, of course, there are certain commonalities with the broader Nepali literature, because when we just talk about Nepali literature, it talks about literature produced in Nepali from Nepal, as well as the Indian Nepali literature, also the Nepali literature produced globally by the Nepali-speaking population settled in different countries of the world. So the present focus is primarily of the literature of the Gorkha community in India. Now, who are the Gorkhas? Basically, why this literature becomes important for us to understand, why the language becomes important for us to understand, is that Gorkha is a community which has settled in different parts of India. Almost all states in India have Gorkha population, but majority of the Gorkhas are found in the states of West Bengal, Assam, Sikkim, Uttarakhand, Arunachal Pradesh, Himachal Pradesh, Maharashtra, Manipur, Meghalaya, Nagaland, and Mizoram. Now, from all these places, we have, typical kind of Nepali language being spoken and literature being produced. And the amalgamation of the literature by the Indian Gorkhas from these different parts of India is called the Indian Nepali literature. So Indian Nepali literature is basically the literature of that particular language, that is Nepali, the native language, which is spoken by a number of people in India, that is the Gorkha community in India. Now, we need to understand that when we talk about Nepali as a language, we had the language in India for a significant period of time. I should say that there are historical, a lot of historical debates on the Nepali community or the Gorkha community in India. Will not get into that. But the language came to be recognized as an official language of the Indian Union by the 71st Constitutional Amendment Act in 1992. And it was incorporated in the 8th schedule of the Indian Constitution, along with Manipuri and Konkani languages. So as an official Indian language, Nepali is a language in the 8th schedule since 1992. And it's just been around 33 years now, Nepali being recognized as an official language of India. Despite 3 decades of the Nepali language being officially recognized, it is not taken too seriously, both in the study of languages as well as literatures in India. It has remained marginalized. And there are many reasons for this marginalization. First is that there is a very insignificant population, say around 0.3% to 0.4% of the total population of India constitutes the Gorkhas. And there is a widespread perception among the mainstream Indian population that Nepali culture is a very marginal culture. Okay, and the Nepali language is therefore of insignificant interest because it is a language of a very insignificant amount of population, right? So that is one. Now, consequently, what has happened is it has not been considered worthy of attention in the Indian context so much, unlike any other language or literature. Now, having said that, where do we find the interest in studying the Indian Nepali language and literature? If it is of marginal interest to the mainstream Indian researchers and academicians. Now, the interest basically stems from the community itself because of the spatio-temporal specific in which the community locates itself and the consequences of such location to the issues of identity and belonging of the community. So therefore, it is basically the issue of self-identification that constitutes the central aspect which acts as a driving force for the community to, encourage and foster the development of the Nepali language and literature. This is one important area that we need to understand. Until recently, this problem was very acute at the political level because there was so much of the problem of identification. Okay? A lot of activists from different fields within the community also sought to shape a new identity for the Indian Nepalis. If we look at the 1980s, the period is very significant because it had unleashed a kind of violent identity movement in the northern part of West Bengal. Now, the whole issue of identity has become very important to the Gorkhas, and it is in search for such identity that the self-identification process has become stronger, and that had led to, a lot of studies on the Nepali literature itself. Another issue is such problem of identity also emerges basically because of the nature of geography of South Asia. We find a lot of Gorkha or Nepali population in neighboring countries. We have Nepal as a separate state. We also have Nepalis in the neighboring countries of Bhutan, also in Myanmar, and not the least in places like Thailand, in the nearby areas. Forget about the population of the Nepalis in Europe, America, and other parts of the world. So the basic problem in South Asia is when we look at the India-Nepal border, it's a porous border. And therefore, the 1950 Indo-Nepal Treaty has a lot to do with the issue of identity. There is a free flow of Nepali citizens onto India, and therefore the Indian mainstream population sees all Nepalis, irrespective of their place of origin, as foreigners. And that leads to a complication in terms of identity of the community. Hence, when we look at the whole struggle since the early 1960s, immediately after India's independence, right? And this struggle initially was for the recognition of the Nepali language as an official language of India. What we find here is we have time and again found the struggle trying to show the basic differences in the language patterns of the both spoken and written of the Nepali language in Nepal and in India. And there is a set of differences that ultimately led to the recognition of Indian Nepali language under the 8th schedule. So that is why, as Indians, when we try to understand languages as markers of identity, we also need to give equal importance when we are talking about inclusive education to understand someone else's language and therefore their own identity within the Indian federal framework. So that necessitates the importance of understanding the evolution and development of Nepali language within the Indian context, a separate Indian Nepali language distinct from the Nepali language in Nepal. Second thing is, when we're talking about the issue of identity and the recurring themes in Nepali literature being the issue of belonging and identity, we also need to understand the process of evolution of political consciousness among the Indian Gorkhas. And to understand that, say, for instance, if we look at critical works like Narigle's observation that Habermas's influential analysis of the connections between communicative practices, literary audiences, and the political public within modernity is highly suggestive for the relation between norms of communicative rationality and distribution of political power in the making of non-Western modernities, which suits very well with the context of the Indian Nepalis, because it is this, the literary audience and the kind of press and publications during the colonial times that led to the development of a different kind of political consciousness among the Indian Nepalis. So for us as Indians to understand these also warrants a need for the understanding of Indian Nepali language and literature. Now, I would just like to give an example of one very interesting, statement made by Indra Bahadur Rai. He is a Sahitya Academy, Puraskar winner of 1977. A professor of English language and literature, teaching at St. Joseph's College, later turned into a Nepali linguist and a very high figure in Nepali literature. He has talked about the self-identification as an important theme within the Indian Nepali nationalism literature in his essay, Indian Nepali Nationalism and Nepali Poetry. Now, what is the context? He talks about this. Anyone, he says, who claims to study the past and at the same time refers to Indian Nepalis as settlers and migrants reveals a complete ignorance of the history of this region. After the Anglo-Nepalese War of 1816, under the Treaty of Sugauli, Nepal was forced to cede hundreds of thousands of square miles of Nepali territory, which constitutes the modern-day Sikkim, Garhwal, part of the Terai region, and part of the modern state of Himachal Pradesh, to British East India Company, along with the Nepalis living there. These Nepalis were the ancestors of modern Indian Nepalis, whose population in contemporary India is approximately 6 million. So it is in this context that I would like to draw your attention to the history of evolution of Indian Nepali literature. Now, despite the relatively recent recognition of Nepali as an official language in India, the history of Nepali literature created on the Indian soil stretches back to centuries. Now, Sikkim, when you look at Sikkim today, it's a part and parcel of India. is the 22nd state of the Indian Union. But Sikkim was merged with India only in 1975. Now, if you look at the Nepali literature in the Indian soil, if we take Sikkim to be a part of India, okay, despite its merger only in 1975, we can locate the earlier Nepali literary, records somewhere in the mid of the 1800s. This is one very important part of the growth of Nepali literature. Again, another thing is also important. It is difficult to discuss Indian Nepali literature as a distinct literary tradition, since many names and works are significant for Nepali speaking population, both in India as well as in Nepal. And they share a very common cultural past. They also share religious commonalities and a lot of commonalities in terms of traditions. The border between these two countries has historically been open, allowing their residents to move freely and exchange cultural experiences. And hence, we have a lot of overlapping when we talk about literature, because literature from Nepal has influenced the Indian Nepali literature and vice versa. Nevertheless, here we are going to focus more specifically in the Indian context. When we talk about language, grammar constitutes a very important aspect of any language. The first grammar of Nepali language was printed by J. Ayton at the Fort William College printing press in Calcutta in 1820. So by 1820 in India, we had already written and published a grammar of the Nepali language, which means the process of evolution of Nepali language and literature in the Indian soil was far more beyond 1800s, because by 1820, grammar was already produced for the college. At the end of the book, this particular grammar book, we also have 3 short stories appended in that grammar. And it is interesting that the value of these 3 short stories appended at the end of this grammar of the Nepali language, published in 1820, is the fact that they represent the first printed prose text in Nepali in the Indian soil. So 1820, we also had already 3 stories printed. Okay, so the history of the prose can be found in 1820, already being in the press, right? So in 1821, the first translation of the Bible into Nepali, okay, it had taken place. So translation into Nepali took place of the Bible by 1821, and it was published by the Serampur Mission, okay, and by 1836, the first translated collection of short stories, 25 Tales of Vitala, was also published, but the author of this collection is unknown. So we have the origin somewhere in the 1800s, a very significant and solid origin of the Nepali language and literature in India. In colonial India, if we see, 2 cities plays a very significant role in the development of Indian Nepali language and literature. One is Varanasi in Uttar Pradesh, and the other one is Darjeeling in West Bengal. So Varanasi and Darjeeling were the 2 centers of Nepali language and literature in India. In the 19th century, Varanasi was the largest center of traditional education. By traditional education, we mean the education in the Sanskrit education, right? Following the political upheaval of 1846, now we see a lot of overlapping of the development of Nepali language and literature in Nepal and India. 1846, when much of the Nepali aristocracy was eliminated and power was shifted to Jangabahadur Rana, there was no higher educational institution in Nepal. And until the early part of the 20th century, no journals or newspapers were published from Nepal, with all literary works being subject to censorship in Nepal. As a result, what happened was many young people seeking an education, they traveled from Nepal to Varanasi, where they studied Sanskrit and also later English. Because of this large Nepali-speaking population, okay, studying Sanskrit and English in Varanasi, they started producing a lot of linguistic and literary works in Nepali. Now, the works of this group of people, in fact, constitutes a part of history of both the Nepal's history of Nepali language and literature, as well as history of Indian Nepali language and literature, because it's a meeting point of people both from India as well as from Nepal. Because of the political turmoil in Nepal, educational hub for all the intellectuals in Nepal had shifted from Nepal to Varanasi. Now, again, because of the large number of Nepali-speaking population, large means almost the significant population other than the British, Darjeeling gradually, it began to transform into second Indian center of Nepali language, literature, and culture. Why second? Because first was already Varanasi. Okay? From Varanasi, the epicenter of language, literature, and culture shifted to Darjeeling, another colonial town in India. Even after independence, and even today, Darjeeling continues to play this significant role as the epicenter of Nepali language, literature, and culture. Now, Varanasi is said to have produced a unique school of its own when it comes to Nepali language and literature. Usually it is referred to as the Varanasi School of Nepali Literature and Language. At the early stage of development of Nepali literary Nepali language, it is very impossible to separate its development in India and Nepal. Until the 19th century, Sanskrit was the literary language in Nepal. So the first works in Nepali were translations or adaptations from Sanskrit into Nepali language. The first Nepali poet, that is Bhanuvakta Acharya, who lived between 1814 to 1868. Although he was born, he lived and he worked primarily in the modern territory of Nepal. He received his education in Varanasi and was well versed in the classical Indian tradition. Bhanuvakta created the Nepali avatar of the Ramayana. He wrote Ramayana in Nepali, okay, around 1853 approximately. The first literary work in Nepali based on Adhyatma Ramayana. For him, it was important to translate this sacred text into Nepali to make it accessible to the broader audience and facilitate the spiritual transformation of people who read and listen to it and contribute to the development of the Nepali society by way of inculcation of spiritual values. In Vanuvakta's Ramayana, what we also can look at is very interesting. Rama is not seen as a superhuman. Rama is first and foremost seen as a human, and only after that as a deity. For this work, Vanuvakta, this work means this Vanuvakta's work on Ramayana, which is in the poetic genre, he earned the title of being the Adi Kavi. So Vanuvakta is referred to as Adi Kavi Vanuvakta, or the first poet. So significantly, for a long period of time, the Varanasi school had a strong presence, and works were created using high Sanskrit vocabulary and complex meters. Notable authors of this period include Rajiv Lochana Joshi, who poetically described his journey to Kedarnath and Badrinath, in his literary works. Another one is Homanath Khatiwala, who lived between 1854 to 1927 and translated some excerpts from the Mahabharata into Nepali. And Chiranjeev Sarma, who lived between 1867 to 1940 and who completed the prose translation of the Bhagavata Purana into Nepali in 1892. So these were the representative figures of the Varanasi School of Nepali Language and Literature. Motiram Bhatta, again, who lived between 1866 to 96, studied Sanskrit. He also studied Persian, English in Varanasi. And during his education, he became involved in literary circle led by Bharatendu Harishchandra. He also organized the Rasik Samaj group, which aimed to promote the development of Nepali literature. Motiram was first to compose ghazals in Nepali literature. So ghazal tradition is attributed to Motiram Bhatta. In 1886 in Varanasi, he began publishing the first Nepali language journal called the Gorkha Bharat Jivan, which, however, could not last for a long time. It sustained only 3 months. Now, after this, tradition influenced so much by Sanskrit, we have another tradition coming into as a part and parcel of the evolution of Nepali language and literature, and that is the Savai tradition. Savai tradition basically are of two types when we look at it from the perspective of Indian Nepali literature. The first one is the religious Savai or the sacred Savai, and the other one is the secular Savai. In the second half of the 18th century, a new religious movement emerged in Nepali society, forming the Jasmani sect among the poets who followed this sect and tried to propagate the beliefs of the sect through Savais, where Sasidhar was born in 1747. The followers of this tradition of that was developed by Sasidhar and others is called the Sadhukari tradition. Now, Sadhukari tradition means the tradition of the pure language, which was a unique blend of words from Awadhi, Braj, and Nepali. The saints created traditional stutis, which embodied the religious reform ideas promoted by the sect, affecting even the social sphere. Sasidhar, who is also very quite often referred to as Nepali Kabir, he spoke against polytheism, idol worship, caste system, and oppression of women in his sacred savais. His teachings called for equality among all believers before God, and one of the followers of Sasidhar, okay, that is Gyandil Das, he went to Darjeeling to spread the sect's ideas, and through his works, he tried to, inculcate in people the ideas of this particular sect. And one of his famous work in the form of the sacred savai is the Udaya Lahari. Udaya Lahari, to translate into English, would mean the wave of joy, which was written in 1877 in the traditional folk meter, okay, that is the savai. The poem consists of 109 verses in which the poet criticizes the prevailing religious and social conditions in the society. He also criticizes superstitions and prejudices, and Gyandil calls for a rejection of rituals and ceremonies and advocates for union with the Supreme God through sincere spiritual service in his famous work, the Udaya Lahari. Now, another category of savai, as I told you, is the secular savai that we find in Nepali literature in India. They were highly popular and often commemorated significant historical events. Many savai poems were written and they were dedicated to military campaigns. For instance, we can have a reference to Tulchan Ale's Savai on the Battle of Manipur, that was written in 1893. Dhanbir Bhandari's Savai on the Battle of Abor Hills. Gazvi Rana's Savai on the Battle of Naga Hills, 1913. Naval Singh Gharti's Savai on the war with Germany, that is during the time of First World War, 1918. These are the examples of work that focused on military history. Other savai poems were written and they were influenced by natural disasters. For instance, we have Dakman Rai's Savai on the landslides in Darjeeling, that is 1899, and Atmaram Thapa's Savai on the earthquake in Bhakshu, that is present-day Dharamsala in Himachal Pradesh, written in 1905. These works reflect the dynamic interaction between Nepali culture, historical events, and literary expressions. Now, as a wave of development in the late 19th and going up to the mid 20th century, Nepali literature saw significant development despite early setbacks. The first journal in Nepali, that is Gorkha Bharat Jivan, only lasted for a few months, but it paved the way for future publications. Because by now, say mid-90s, okay, early 1990s, 1900s, in 1901, Gorkha Khabar Kagas was published from Darjeeling, and it continued up to 1932. Almost for 30 years, Gorkha Khabar Kagas continued as a literary magazine. Ganga Prasad Pradhan, Pastor Ganga Prasad Pradhan, I should say rather, 1853 to 1932, the long-time editor of this magazine, he played a very pivotal role in the establishment of this journal. He was born into a very wealthy Newar family. He received education at a missionary school and later converted to Christianity. He dedicated his life to educating children and popularizing Nepali literature. So in his works also you find some kind of development of children's literature in Indian Nepali literature. He also helped Father Archibald Turnbull. We have a school called Turnbull School today, named after Archibald Turnbull, who lived between 1843 to 1901 in Darjeeling, because it is Turnbull who created the grammar and dictionary of the Nepali language, which was published in 1888. Now, 1888 is significant because one of the oldest missionary schools in Darjeeling, called the St. Joseph's School, which is called St. Joseph's College rather, was established in 1888, the year in which Turnbull published the grammar and dictionary of the Nepali language. Okay. Now, the language described in this book, or language that is used in this book, Dictionary of the Nepali language. So, in this book, Nepali language is described, and the language used there, the kind of language that is described, it is very different from the language used in Varanasi or in Nepal. So that is why we talk about a distinct Indian Nepali language. In 1878, Ganga Prasad published a Nepali translation of the Bible, as well as books for children. And he also produced a work on Nepali proverbs, marking important contributions to preservation and promotion of Nepali language and literature. Then at the beginning of the 20th century, Nepali literature witnessed a unique development, with authors striving to cultivate language through various literary forms. Many of these authors were poets, prose writers, and publicists. Literary life during this time mainly centered around journals, which became vital platforms for publication. In 1906, Sundari magazine was published in Varanasi. It featured serialized romantic and adventure novels, as well as plays in Nepali, both original and translated from Bengali literature. The magazine lasted only for 2 years before it was shut down by the British colonial authorities, because the articles in the magazine advocated for Indian independence. So if we look at the contribution of Nepali literature during the India's national movement, we find a significant contribution from Indian Nepali language and literature towards the development of political consciousness among the Indian Nepalis and contribution towards Indian national movement. In 1919, Dharanidhar Koirala, who was a prominent educator, he began teaching Nepali at the government high school in Darjeeling. In 1923, Surya Bikram Gyawali joined as a history teacher. Together with another Nepali teacher, Parasmani Pradhan, they formed a literary trio. And these three are together called the Su-Da-Pa. Su referring to Surya Bikram Gyawali, okay? Da to Dharanidhar Koirala, and Pa to Parasmani Pradhan. In 1924, Su-Da-Pa founded the Nepali Literary Society, which is called the Nepali Sahitya Sammelan, and published works by the three of them, along with the works of Bhanubhakta, work on Bhanubhakta. See, this was the biography of Bhanubhakta, was produced by Motiram Bhatta, and it was published by the Su-Da-Pa. Okay. The historical tales of Surya Bikram Gyawali, okay, they were also published in journals which were run by Su-Da-Pa. Okay. Additionally, journals like Gorkha Sathi, which began in 1907 from Calcutta, were initiated for the purpose of promoting independence promoting the idea of independence and freedom among the Indian Nepali-speaking population. Following this, magazines such as Chandrika, Gorkhali were published from Banaras. These journals saw contributions from significant writers like Devi Prasad Sapkota, Dharanidhar Koirala, Surya Vikram Gyawali, who all made substantial contributions to the growth of Indian Nepali literature. In 1918, Chandrika was launched in Darjeeling and Karshaung under the editorship of Parasmani Pradhan. In 1921, in Dehradun, Thakur Chandan Singh founded the political organization called the All India Gorkha League, which aimed at opposing British colonial rule and organizing efforts among Gorkha soldiers who served in the British Army. In 1926, Chandan Singh began publishing Gorkha Samsar, which was a journal which highlighted the political activities of the League. 2 years later, he launched another journal called Tarun Gorkha. In 1935, Man Singh Grung, previously the editor of Gorkhali in Banaras, published new journal that is Gorkha Sevak, initially in Shillong in Meghalaya and later in Assam. During the 1930s, new journals such as Adars and Nebula were published in Darjeeling, and they focused on social issues and conditions of the people living in the region. Now, especially in the 1930s and after that, we see the advent of Romanticism in Indian Nepali literature. Under the influence of Bengali literary traditions, the short stories, began to develop within the Indian Nepali literature. Rup Narayan Sinha was a successful lawyer in Darjeeling, and he was influenced by English and Bengali literature, and is known for his psychological depth in his works. His few stories are important. Annapurna, that was published in 1927. Katha Navaratna, that is nine precious stories. Okay? And the most important one here being the Brahmar. Brahmar, okay? Which translates to into English as the mistake. Brahmar is the story that follows the main character, Sekhar, a student at the University of Calcutta, who returns to Darjeeling for the holidays and meets his ideal girl, Veena. Through his interactions with her, Sekhar realizes that the true meaning of love lies in submission and sacrifice. It is said that Brahmar is the entry point of Romanticism in the Indian Nepali literature. While the central theme of the novel revolves around the romantic experiences of the protagonist, the narrative also dedicates a considerable attention to depicting the lives of Indian Nepali people in various locations such as Darjeeling, Calcutta, Assam, Varanasi, and Burma, which Sekhar travels through. The novel marks a significant movement in Nepali literature as it introduced the fate of Indian Nepali as a key subject for future Nepali language novelists. Nepali literature saw emergence of another great trio, Leknath Paudel, Balkrishna Sam, and Lakshmi Prasad Devkota in the 1900s again. Rahul Sanskritayan, whom every one of us know, once remarked that Devkota, in terms of expressiveness, even surpassed the three great Hindi poets like J. Prasad, S. Panta, and S. Tripathi, the Nirala. By the mid-20th century, the influence of Premchand's work was significant on prose, and Nepali literature began to form the foundational principles of various literary types, including poetry, short stories, novels, and others. One of the most well-known modern Indian Nepali poets is Agam Singh Giri. His works are characterized by a nostalgic tone and a high sense of pathos. His poetry collections include Jivan Git, which means song of life, Meru Kavita, which means my poetry, Jaleko Pratibimba, Roeko Pratidhwani, meaning burning sign, screaming echo. One of his notable works is the poem Yuddha Ra Yuddha, War and Soldier, dedicated to Nepali soldiers who laid down their lives in various military conflicts. Giri's poetry is notable for employing both traditional Sanskrit meters and new ones inspired by European styles. Another notable poet of Nepali origin is Haribhakta Katwal, who was born in Assam. His books, Samjana, which means memory, and Bhitri Manse Bolna Khojda, which means the man, the inner, the man begins an inner monologue, contains lyrical poems that focus on everyday concerns of human life. Katwal also compiled the anthology, that is Purva Kiran, which means rays from the east, which includes poems by Assamese poets of Nepali origin. Now, we also see Okuyama Gwain in 1920, born in 1920, who is a poet. Actually, Gwain is not Nepali or Gorkha by origin. He is half Japanese and half Tibetan, but he traveled and settled in Darjeeling, learned the language, and he became an important linguistic and literary figure among the Indian Nepalis. Okay. Prose writer whose works are deeply emotional, seeing beauty in everyday life and perceiving it as a reflection of eternity. What is remarkable is Gwain's poems demonstrate an exceptional command of the language, because he himself is not by birth a Nepali speaking person. Okay, but he learned and then he developed the command over the language. He also translated works into Nepali, including Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali. It was translated into Nepali by Gwain, William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, and Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. These important works were translated into Nepali by Okuyama Gwain. Shiv Kumar Rai, 1919 to 1995, received Indian Literary Academy Award in 1978 for his short story Khahare, which means a streamlet. His most famous work is Machako Mool, which means the price of fish, published in 1945. Now, this tells the story of a fisherman who dies in a flood in a mountain stream. Rai is known not only for Nepali language writer, but also as a prominent political figure, because he was the first Nepali, Indian Nepali to join the cabinet of ministers of West Bengal. Now, during this time, other important literary figures include Lion Singh Bangdel and Lil Bahadur Chetri from Assam. Then, in the later half of the 1950s or early 1960s, we see a category of authors who call themselves the iambic writers. Okay, iambic writers. Iam as a dimension. Okay, Tesro Iam. They call themselves the authors of the Tesro Iam. And the three important authors who represent the Tesro Iam literature in beginning the early 1960s, I should say, okay, they are, just a minute. Tesro Iam, okay. 1 second. In the 1960s, okay. These authors, they began experimenting more with language, focusing more on inner hidden lives of their characters. This period saw a greater emphasis on psychological depth and personal expression. In 1963, the first issue of the journal was also named Tesro Iam. Okay, the third dimension was published in Darjeeling. The journal was edited by Til Vikram Nimbang, whose pen name was Bairagi Kaila. This journal featured poetry by Bairagi Kaila himself and his colleague Ishwar Ballabh, and also short stories by Indra Bahadur Rai. The literary group behind Tesroayam was distinctive not only for producing works within a shared literary direction, but also for their theoretical exploration of their artistic and aesthetic principles. That is what they said they added to the already existing flat two-dimensional literature. That's why they preferred to call their literature as three-dimensional literature. Okay. Their theory is mainly focused on relationship between literature, real life, and individual creativity of the writer, as well as the development of a new aesthetic for Nepali literature. In most of the editorials of the journal Tesroayam, the editor himself, that is Bairagi Kaila, he explained that the Nepali poets of the older generation, according to him, had created flat two-dimensional poetry that no longer met the intellectual needs of the modern readers. And therefore, the goal of the new poets was to infuse their works with depth, adding a third dimension to fully reflect human life. They believed that to achieve this, they had to move beyond the limits of traditional poetic expression and embrace new concepts of language and style. They blend traditional Nepali imagery with new elements influenced by Western poetic traditions. Their work emphasizes experimentation with poetic language and addresses contemporary issues in Nepali society. For instance, one example is Mateko Mancheko Bhashan माथिको मान्छेको भाषण मध्यरात पछिको सडकसित माथिको मान्छेको भाषण मध्यरात पछिको सडकसित means a drunkard's conversation with the street after midnight. So that is one of the poem written by Bairagi Kaila, and in this he offers an unexpected portrayal of an intellectual depicted in the guise of a drunkard. This approach reflected group's desire to challenge the conventional forms and offer fresh perspectives on social issues. Indra Bahadur Rai gained significant recognition for his critical works, but his short stories deserve attention. One of his notable stories is Hami Jastai Maina Ki Ama. Okay, Hami Jastai Maina Ki Ama, which has been written in an expressionist style. The story centers on Minaki, a character, a woman selling vegetables in Darjeeling market. Through fragmented episodes, Minaki is portrayed in different temporal layers, revealing the history of Darjeeling and its inhabitants. Now we have referred to Okayama Gwain. Okayama Gwain also has followed the footstep of the writers of the Tesroayam or the third dimension. Okay? His two famous novels, Nagbeli, written in 1970, and Sunakhari, 1978, for which he received the Indian Literary Academy Award in 1980. Because the titles were symbolic, Nagbeli